Welcome to this special edition of Catholic Current. From Washington, D.C., I'm Maria Mazzenga. As the nation marks its 250th year, we are discussing and celebrating the contributions of Catholics to this nation. Today in studio to discuss Catholics and the immigration experience are Julia Young and Maria Mazzenga. Both are historians and professors at the Catholic University of America. Welcome, Julia and Maria. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
So in this series, we've discussed the role of English Catholics in Maryland in the American founding. And today we're going to be reflecting on the different immigrant communities that have come to this country and made the American Catholic Church what she is today. Before we get to that, can you say something about English Catholicism? Are there aspects of that religious practice maybe that would seem strange to us today? And are there any elements that have endured? Maria?
Well, the one distinctive aspect of I guess you would say, English immigrant Catholicism, I think of Maryland, especially because Maryland, of course, was a Catholic colony at first, is that they felt that they had to practice their Catholicism in their house. So it was a domestic form of Catholicism. For one thing, they didn't want to irritate the larger Protestant population, so they kept it indoors. And it was largely solidified among the gentry. So the gentry kind of ran Catholicism at that time, which is going to be in huge contrast with the largely immigrant Catholicism that comes later on.
Yeah, let's talk about the immigration that comes later on. How did immigration in the 19th century challenge the American church, and how did it challenge the United States?
Well, I think it might be helpful just to talk about the sort of sequence of immigration over the 19th century, right? Because the United States, at least the eastern part of the United States, with the exception of Florida, is colonized by the British initially. And so Catholics are a minority, a really quite small minority in Maryland and within the colonies. But as the country expands, we begin to incorporate former colonies and territorial areas of Spain. And so we incorporate Spanish-speaking Catholic population. So that's why the oldest Catholic church in the United States is actually in Florida, right? So that's not an immigration. It's more of a, we didn't cross the border crossed us situation. But then as we get into the 19th century or further into the 19th century, we start to see these sort of successive waves of migration from mostly Europe. Although as we get to the very end of the 19th century, we start to see them from other places. And those waves are, you can help me with the order, but sort of German Catholics, maybe some...
German Catholics, Irish Catholics.
Yeah.
They're mostly working class. And they mostly come because they're impoverished. And in places like New York, you had Archbishop John Hughes, and he became this really strong advocate of building infrastructure to educate these Catholics, orphanages, and you see the rise of a massive Catholic infrastructure with the influx of first Irish, then German, and then later on you've got Eastern European, Polish, Lithuanian, and Italian Catholics. And that's when you see a working class immigrant Catholicism rise, at least on the East Coast, and then the upper Midwest. And that's when you see this growth of a whole Catholic infrastructure of churches, parochial schools, and hospitals along the Eastern Seaboard and up into Chicago.
Okay. What Catholic immigrant contributions to American life do you think maybe have been overlooked?
Well, as these successive waves of mostly European Catholic immigrants arrived in the 19th century, the Catholic Church grew as an institution and also developed all of these sort of, what's the word? Not institutions.
Infrastructure?
But infrastructure. Really developed a kind of infrastructure to meet the needs of these new communities. So the Catholic Church built an enormous school system, a parochial school system.
The largest in the world.
The largest in the world, wow.
A parochial school system.
Some of us are products of that school system. And they ran, you mentioned orphanages before, they ran orphanages.
Hospitals.
I mean, some of us were born at Catholic hospitals, right? And some of that is still with us today, the hospitals especially. So that might be one thing that's sort of ignored. But you also have, I know you've talked some in your work about Catholics being influential in U.S. politics, and particularly as we get into the 20th century. So
for example, Theodore Roosevelt was good friends with Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore. And Gibbons would go and chat with him informally about different political issues, especially immigration quotas, which the Catholic Church was against in the early 20th century. By the 1930s, F.D. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, had started reaching out to Catholic priests such as Father John A. Ryan, Francis Haas, and other priests who had written extensively on things like a living wage and labor issues. And FDR actually had them as kind of an informal cabinet, and he consulted regularly with people like Father John Ryan and Haas, and they helped develop things like the Social Security program in the US and advised him on labor issues. So a lot of that structure that you see of the American, the Catholic welfare system gets transferred over to the American government at a time when it was most needed in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So you can't really separate Catholics, I don't think, from the broader social welfare network and how it's influenced the US government system as well. So that's a huge contribution.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
I want to
go ahead, Julia.
thing, but you can use it or not, which is that another, I think if this answers the question or helps answer the question, another huge contribution is just all the Catholic immigrants themselves and then their children and grandchildren and descendants who were often products of these parish churches and parish schools and went on to be educated and go to Catholic colleges. We're both at the Catholic University of America, which was built in the late 19th century as a kind of culmination of building a Catholic educational infrastructure in the United States. And so that by the 20th century, there really had been, the Catholic Church had really participated in almost the acculturation of so many Catholics who had their roots in, these very poor immigrants and very poor sort of flows of immigrants who are leaving from Europe. And so that by the 20th century, maybe not right at the beginning of the 20th century, but by the mid 20th century, there is a massive generation of educated, talented Catholics who are starting to engage in politics, play a political role. We have a Catholic president, and at mid-century, and so I think that's another way that this immigration and then the growth of the church and the response of the church to immigration helped to really shape U.S. society in the 20th century. And now as you say, you can't really tease it out. What is Catholic society and what is American society?
And I would even say the church had an assimilative function, and they had all kinds of Americanization programs, and they would teach Catholics that spoke other languages English. We have up in the archives at Catholic University all kinds of civics manuals. So they would go to schools where they would not only learn English, but learn citizenship and work toward becoming citizens in the United States too. And the church was the institution that helped them through that process.
Yeah, and the church still does with agencies like Catholic Charities today. They're still helping people naturalize and prepare for their citizenship tests and things like that.
Yeah,
so.
we can talk about that. There is a direct line between that story and what the church does today.
Yeah. Now, immigration is currently one of the neuralgic issues in American public life, and the Catholic Church is right in the middle of it. Certainly, this isn't the first time we have found ourselves here. How have the Catholic bishops and leaders responded in the past when this issue came to the forefront of political debate?
Well, Maria and I have both worked on this, so we'll both talk about it. But so the Catholic Church as an institution was very concerned with meeting the needs of these Catholic immigrants. And it's not just selfless, right? They want to keep them Catholic. And they know these Catholic immigrants are coming into a Protestant country. And so, it's also in their interest to make sure that they remain connected to their Catholic faith and their Catholic heritage. So the Catholic Church becomes very concerned, especially in the last quarter of the 19th century, where there's a really massive influx of immigrants from especially Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Italy. I mean, Italy is the country that sends the largest number, I think the largest single country.
Proportionally, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this huge number of Italian Catholics. Many of them are very poor, very low levels of education. They're leaving rural Italy. There's a lot of comparisons you could make to rural Latin American migrants today, some rural Latin American migrants today. There is a ton of concern about the welfare of these European and especially Italian immigrants starting in the 1870s and leading into the early 20th century. And so the Catholic Church began, it established in, what was the year? The Immigration Bureau?
1920, I believe.
Oh, okay. Well, so actually, but before 1920, so when does Mother Cabrini come over?
Oh, she came in the late 19th century. Yeah.
Yes,
Frances
late
Cabrini,
19th century.
And she helped establish the network of hospitals throughout the U.S. in the 19th
and
century.
schools. And so you start to see the religious orders, some of the new religious orders, like Mother Cabrini, like is she a Scalabrinian? The Scalabrinians.
I think so.
The Claretians do some of this. So you start to see religious orders
Christian
responding to the needs of these new immigrant communities, ministering to immigrant communities, literally like bringing them food and clothes, helping them find housing, helping them connect them to job opportunities, helping to connect separated family members, helping to teach them English. And so this is already going on in the late 19th century. So then in 1920, the bishops, which it's the National Catholic War Council, right? Which then becomes what eventually becomes USCCB. National Catholic. Yeah, we're right here.
The predecessor, right here.
Thank you, bishops. So they found something called the Immigration Bureau, and that is an attempt to systematize the Catholic Church's already ongoing response to meeting the needs and helping these new waves of immigrants, including helping them with visa paperwork. Right? Like helping them fill out applications. And again, housing, food, family needs, children, welfare, all the social welfare, providing them the social network, social welfare that they needed to get on their feet. And the Immigration Bureau had offices, obviously in New York, Ellis Island, I don't know if it was on Ellis Island, but in New York, I think it was on Ellis Island.
They had people there. I'm not sure if the office was there.
Dub that in. They had offices in Ellis Island there, but take it out if it's not true.
Look it up.
And then Philadelphia, San Francisco. So big port areas. El Paso is the one
huge one.
Yes, hugely important because, and actually now I want to talk about this too, because by the 1920s, you have increasingly Mexican migrants coming across the US-Mexico border, across the southern border, to come and do agricultural work in the Southwest, California, and then they're working in industry in Chicago. And so the Catholic Church, which has already been working with all these other immigrant communities, starts to then minister to the needs of Mexican migrants. And that's really important, I think, for people to understand, because sometimes people think of the church's work with immigrants and its advocacy for immigrants as something very recent and something they're getting into like maybe now for political reasons. And it's actually something that's very consistent with what they've been doing for more than a century. And they're just doing work that they've continuously done.
Yeah, and I would add to that I mean, they were, you want to use the word lobbyists, but people like Bruce Moeller, who ran the department, Mulholland, he's another one that was involved in that. Father Burke, who was the early general secretary of the Bishops' Conference, they would go to Capitol Hill. They would, meet with various kinds of Congress people and try and influence legislation toward, helping Catholics and immigrant Catholics. So the interesting thing is the university being founded here and the Bishops' Conference founded here gave them a direct entryway into like the political figures that are, just a few miles away. So in other words, they've been kind of lobbying for the Catholic immigrant interests, for over 100 years now. So it began
even then, though, it wasn't without controversy, right?
No.
I mean, the work of the Catholic Church in helping immigrants was controversial even in the 1920s and earlier.
Well, remember the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was mostly anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
So you have a huge nativist population in the United States that hates Catholics. And the famous story you probably know of Al Smith running for president. He was Catholic. He ran on the Democratic Party ticket in 1928, and he traveled, across the United States when he was campaigning, and they were burning crosses to say, "We don't want you," and he lost terribly. So there was a strong anti-immigrant sentiment generally in that period too, that they had to contend with for sure.
Yeah. And they were making arguments about why they were doing this work. I mean, one of the things that I came across in the archives of the NCWC, now USCCB, is bishops articulating, or people from the Immigration Bureau articulating, look, immigration causes the separation of families. The family is the most important unit of society. We are trying to help reunite families who have been separated by immigration laws. So there were, increased restrictions at the border and crossing the border. And so they were writing about the work that they were doing. They were taking pictures of the work they were doing, of them ministering to, to mothers and children whose, the father of the family couldn't get across the border, right? And they're writing about these laws are impacting families and are separating families. So I think they knew they were doing somewhat controversial work. I think it's also important to say, though, that there were tensions within Catholicism at the time, just as there are now, about should the focus be on these new immigrants, whoever the new immigrants are, right? Because there's always a generation of new immigrants, and then people who feel that even if they have immigrant roots, who feel like they should have priority. So there were tensions then, and there was racism and like ethno-nationalism within the church. There were tensions over who should be able to sit where, with the Spanish language mass, people feeling like, especially in the areas where there were Mexican migrants, should segregation laws be enforced inside the churches? And so it wasn't that it's all a sort of utopian situation, or that everybody was always saying everyone was always sensitive to these issues, but they were consistently doing this work of advocating for migrants within a society that was pretty unfriendly to migrants a lot of the time.
And I would add to that even that within the church, there was something called the Americanist controversy. And there was a lot of argument over how much Catholics should accommodate to the American system. Because especially in Europe, they thought the American system, you could accommodate too much. So some bishops were more toward, letting Catholics go to non-Catholic schools than others were. And others were more into keeping Catholics more in their own schools and a little more parochial in the general sense than other bishops. So there was a lot of argument over that too within the church.
Yeah. What about the national parishes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's also this whole debate about whether each immigrant group should be able to have its own parish. I mean, it should be able to have its own church, an ethnic church, right? Or whether there should just be one type of church for everybody, and everybody should mix within those churches, right?
Yes, right. So they established, and this was unique in the world, actually, for Catholics, is that they established these national parishes, especially for people who didn't speak English. So you would have Italian national parishes, you would have Polish, Ukrainian, and then, Irish generally were more into territorial parishes. So you had them based on territory or what language that they spoke. And the tensions were, how long do you keep these national parishes national? A lot of the territorial parishes segregated Black Catholics from white Catholics. That was an argument. There was a lot of anger on the part of Black Catholics, justifiably, that they would be segregated within territorial churches. So there was a lot of, how do we organize our churches to best accommodate the population? And there was a lot of argument over that.
And what time period was that, the national
That would
parishes?
Be from late 19th century, and I would say through 50.
Yeah,
1950.
It was a multi-decade kind of situation.
Yeah.
And it
do they do Spanish-speaking churches now? I mean, there are predominantly
They
Spanish
don't-
speaking, but do they actually establish them that way?
No.
Okay.
No.
So that's the national
That's
church
over.
thing.
Yeah, it's over. But it was a real question. And I'm more familiar with the debates when they were happening in the 1920s, because the question was, should there be there already were national parishes for earlier immigrant groups, Italians, Poles, etc. But then the question was, should there be national parishes for Mexicans? And is this something that we want? And there was debate over this.
Right.
But there also at the same time were some of the missionary orders, the Claretians in Chicago are the ones I'm familiar with, that established churches inside Mexican neighborhoods with masses in Spanish so effectively they were still establishing national churches. Yeah. So it's a complicated story, and it's not always, we should be careful not to say, it was all sunshine and roses, right? There were debates within the Catholic Church and tensions within the Catholic Church, just like there are today.
Yeah. And so they must have moved away from that model,
Yes.
right? And became one national, or like one
Territorial.
Yeah,
But the normal method would be territorial. So
Yeah.
people within certain boundaries, I don't mean to cut you off, the people within certain boundaries go to a particular parish. And that's how they are established now, I believe.
Yeah. But there are, the legacy of this, it's not as common, it's not as known here in the DC area, but if you go to Detroit, or you go to Chicago, or you go to Boston,
for sure.
New York, right? Like
They still have that,
Yes.
that
We had that
ethnic-
mentality growing up.
Yeah.
yeah, and people.
Did you go to an Irish one?
I did, yeah.
So right? The movie, the great movie Brooklyn, and the book Brooklyn, and then the movie Brooklyn is about this, the interethnic tensions between Irish and Italian Catholics who were Catholics, right? But they're the way they practice Catholicism looks really different. Their devotional patterns look really their devotional practices look really different. And that's also something that, despite the fact that the national parish model is over, and in fact the number of parish churches is shrinking, right? So that's also sort of solved the debate. But that's also something that still, I think, leads to sometimes tension and sometimes flourishing in Catholic parishes, right? People bring really different Catholic devotional practices, and that can be a kind of challenge for a parish that has an established community. When a new community comes in, and they're primarily people from a different culture, a different community, and they have different feast days, different procession, different fiestas, practices, but then sometimes and I think ultimately, it can often work out to be this really beautiful thing, like at St. Camillus up in Silver Spring, where they have an incredibly diverse Catholic church, and there's a lot of intermingling and sharing of practices, devotional
St.
practices.
Anthony's festivals usually attract like all kinds of Catholics, even though they're usually in Italian neighborhoods.
Yes.
So
At St. Camillus, the Bangla population, the Indian Catholics, revere St. Anthony.
Yeah. I mean,
Brings them all together. The American Catholic Church, as we were just saying, is extraordinarily diverse. Part of the American experience is that people from different countries, like we just said, often find themselves sharing cities, neighborhoods with people from other countries. How have different immigrant communities found support with one another?
when are we talking about? Because I'm just thinking about the current moment, and when it will be very interesting to see, because when all immigrants are being targeted, or so many immigrants are being targeted sort of indiscriminately for mass deportation, it'll be interesting to see if people are banding together, and the bishops are speaking out for all of those diverse communities, many of those communities of recent immigrants. So I think we're in a moment like that now, historically.
That's one way to look at it. And I was thinking of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, which is the predecessor of Catholic Charities USA. And the St. Vincent de Paul Society supported all different types of, obviously different Catholic immigrants, and then became supportive of anyone that needed help, that was Catholic or not Catholic. So I think, again, to go to an infrastructure like hospitals or charity, there's always been an attempt to bridge across different groups. like St. Vincent de Paul or the Catholic hospital system, especially. I'm not sure about orphanages if they took in everyone, but so those institutions I think were mediating between these different groups from the 19th century onward.
And there's also something about like the institutional infrastructure is there, and then as different people come in, it's ready to receive them and to help them. So Deborah Cantor has written about this in Mexican Chicago with the churches that were established by the Poles or the Italians or whatever, the earlier generations. And then as Chicago became a more and more Mexican and Puerto Rican city, or just as new immigrant groups arrived, such as Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, they started going to those churches. And sometimes there's some tension, but there's also a story of, sort of incorporation, adaptation. And I think that's a really cool element of U.S. Catholic history, is that the church has expanded. It has expanded. Like these waves of immigrants have caused it to become more multi-layered and rich and culturally rich in a really nice way. And you don't see as much of in Catholic churches in Europe, for example.
Right.
I mean, when I was in Italy, and they're beautiful, and they are beginning to, as Europe sees more immigration, they're beginning to do some of that. But I think people use the term tapestry all the time, but the history of the Catholic Church is this like richly embroidered tapestry that's really beautiful to look at.
If it works.
If it works.
If it's a good metaphor. Well, that's a good metaphor. Let's keep using it.
Well, if the metaphor works and if the actual tapestry works, which I think it does sometimes, and then sometimes there are moments of tension, or it frays, as a tapestry can do.
Well, this next question is about the tensions. How has the Catholic Church dealt with tensions between immigrant groups? And are there times that we can look back on as moments of grace?
Moments of grace.
Think about that. I would say the movie Brooklyn.
Yeah. Well, and Mother Cabrini too, coming over, and I think they told her initially to leave. I think it was Michael Corrigan, Bishop Michael Corrigan. He told her to leave New York, and the Pope had asked her to come to serve the New York immigrant population, and the Archbishop at the time, I think, told her, "We don't need you," and she said, "No, I'm staying." That kind of persistent, if you want to call that grace, I don't know. And I think, I think just the, and there are all different Catholic leaders throughout history that have decided to minister to populations. Some of them we don't even know their names, that just go and contribute to, charitable causes, Catholic Charities, for example. And those are moments of grace that Catholics help Catholics coming up, and Catholics help Catholics that are different from them. I'm trying to think of like specific examples. She's one that I think of.
She's a good example. Yeah. I mean, I was just, I know I've already pulled the movie Brooklyn card, but I was just thinking about marriage and about the ways that people who are, that Catholics, all kinds of people, but Catholics who are from different backgrounds or traditions or parishes over generations eventually begin to form a part of one community. So people marry each other, people intermingle their family. We're at Catholic U, and I always used to joke, or we both teach at Catholic U, and I always used to joke with my students when they're like, "Oh, I'm from Philly, and I'm half Irish and I'm half Italian," and I'd be like, I'm like, hey, the Catholic combination, like classic Catholic combo.
Yeah, my mother grew up in a Irish Catholic parish in the Bronx, and my father grew up in an Italian Catholic parish. And when we were little, we went to both churches, St. Barnabas and St. Francis of Assisi. So, but intermarriage is like a real phenomenon.
Yeah, and then the kids kind of grow up with both those traditions, and they, it's an enriching thing. But what's interesting is that now we have many more students who have, even than when I started 14 years ago, we have many more students whose families have roots in Latin America, right? Like different Catholic culture, and predominantly Catholic, not all Catholic. And so now I'll talk to my students about, their backgrounds or where they grew up. And they'll say, oh, my mom was Salvadoran, my dad was Guatemalan, and I was raised in DC. And I'm like, oh, classic Catholic combination in DC.
In DC, for sure. Yeah.
And then they are almost like this new generation with an American and then a sort of Pan-American identity, and they're Catholic, but they have these beautiful sort of ties to language and culture and tradition. And that's all kind of like meeting and mingling together. And it's really cool to think about, like, what is that going to be in another generation or so? I mean, I think that can be such a source of hope, the story over the last, since the 19th and over the 20th century, and then it's a story of sort of hope for the future.
A great example is the shrine.
Yes.
All the different chapels within the shrine and I just yesterday was at the National Cathedral. I took students to the archives there, and it's beautiful. But the thing about the shrine is the separate chapels representing all the different ethnic traditions. It's super unique. I also just thought of, did you see the woman at graduation last year? We had graduation last year, and she held up a Salvadoran flag when she walked across the stage.
I didn't see that.
One of the students, she held up our flag. She was so proud. Yeah. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. Actually, it was so cool.
Yeah, that basement of the shrine. I mean, if you go in, and the chapels up in the...
Yeah, the bricks, too.
The bricks.
Have all the names of the donors to the church,
Yes, it was like brick by brick.
I think Babe Ruth is on one of them.
I think he is, yeah. So many Italian names, so many Polish names. So it's like this, and you can see the immigration history there. But then, there's the Our Lady of Guadalupe up on the main floor, and there's Our Lady of China, and it's really, it's very cool that the U.S. Catholic Church is so diverse that it actually really reflects the global spread of the Catholic Church. So here in the United States, we have a church that's very American. It's very much a part of U.S. history, and as we talked about, inseparable from U.S. history. And at the same time, it's a church that's been so shaped and so formed by these successive waves of immigrants who are now, at first were maybe mostly European and now are really from all over the globe. So I don't know if that's technically grace. It's hopeful anyway.
I'm going to think about it all night now.
I know.
The whole grace thing. Instances of, I think of Dorothy Day too, or but she's, there's a lot, but she's kind of obvious.
Yeah. No, no.
Her conversion experience was, I think, here, actually.
Was it?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of an example that's not so obvious. Yeah. Anyway. Good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
As immigrant communities find their place in this country, how does the American experience affect them? In addition to their Catholic faith, is there some element that different immigrant communities share that tells us something about what it means to be American?
I'm thinking. Can I answer a little bit with a little bit of a negative answer and then see if you can give it a positive? I'm trying to be positive, and I've written about this, and Maria and I have talked about this a lot in our work. We say America is a nation of immigrants, and it is. It's a nation of lots of things, and it's a complicated history. But immigration is a constant in American history, right? Obviously, there are indigenous people who trace their roots much further back, but this is a nation of successive waves of immigrants. And we have the Statue of Liberty, and I think a lot of us grew up kind of celebrating that, or at least kind of nominally celebrating it. And what we don't talk about as much, but is obviously in the news a lot now, is that we're also a nation that has a lot of complicated feelings about immigrants, about each successive wave of new immigrants. And the example that is always, this is a common example of Ben Franklin worrying about the German immigrants, that they were going to come and destroy this, this new country, and with their weird language and their weird customs, right? And so every generation in this country's history has worried about whatever the new immigrant generation is. So, it's the British worrying about the Germans, and then that generation then worrying about the Irish, and then the Irish worrying about the Italians, and everybody worrying about everybody. And so there is also this persistent history of exclusion. But then I think that if we can have any hope about the future, one way to think about it is that like so many ethnic groups have been subject to that exclusion, but then have managed in one way or another to continue on, to stay here, to like assimilate or even acculturate, like become adapted to US culture, but still maintain pride in and cherished practices from their home culture. So I guess there's, we can and should celebrate immigration. It's made the US the way it is. I think it's also really important to acknowledge the persistence of xenophobia and nativism and anxiety around immigrants and immigration. It's not something that's new, even though it's very much circulating now and impacting national politics now. But successive generations of immigrants have managed to persist and to thrive despite it, and I certainly hope that will continue in the future.
I would take it even a step further and say the Catholic Church, especially across the 20th century, maybe late 19th too, has become the matrix in which people could form dual identities. Mm-hmm. So it can be a bridge where you can maintain roots that go back to the homeland, wherever that homeland is, but also embrace American ideals. That this is a very positive spin,
That's
but
good. It's
but
fine.
just
We don't wanna
I think
feel
along
sad.
with the exclusionary, there is something inclusive as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the church became this matrix where people could do both of those things, and so you'll see Irish American Catholic, Italian American Catholic, Polish American
Mm-hmm.
Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think has been a phenomenon
Mm-hmm.
that's happened, and that would be, I guess, the positive part of it.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maria, Julia, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Mara.
And thank you for joining us for this special edition of Catholic Current. You can find out more about our ongoing celebration of America at 250 by visiting us online at usccb.org or follow us on social media at USCCB. I'm Mara Moser. See you next time.